In today's video, we're painting the Blackhide Wrastler. Welcome back to the Nest, peeps. How have you been? Today, I finally paint the Blackhide Wrastler. I'm super excited to finally get paint on these guys. These models are the models that I was the most excited about when I chose to make the Gatorman army. The Blackhide Wrastler is my favorite sculpt in the Gatorman line for Warmachine and Hordes. It's a big, chunky wrestler that's just going to run at your face and bite it off. I still have not mastered the Wrastler when it comes to the tabletop, but I'm hoping once I get some paint on him, he'll perform a little bit better for me. Get some of that superstition in there. The color scheme that I thought up for the Wrastler is primarily greens. We're going to go with a nice mid-tone vibrant green for the scales. The carapace sections are going to be black with a darker green highlight, and then the belly is going to be a yellow-green to a yellow. For the accent color to the Gatorman army, I chose purple. Yes, I know. I said I was sick of painting purple and I didn't want to paint purple no more, yada yada yada, because of the Legion of Everblight army, but this is purple clothing, and it really, to me, looked best with the green skin and the green base tones of the Gatorman. Now, I like to use the fluorescent paints for glow effects. It gives just a little bit more of that bright, glowy feel, if you know what I mean. Now, the Wrastler doesn't really have any bits on him that glow, but to make it consistent throughout the army, I'm going to make his eyes glow with that magenta. Well, that's enough talking about the paint job and my theories for doing this and doing that. Let's just get into it. This model was prepped with a black primer and a white zenithal undercoat. As I'm applying this green here, I'm starting to realize this is the wrong green. However, I left this in the video to show that mistakes happen and we can recover. And this mistake is easily fixed by applying the correct green over top. The green we're using here is our Danae green, or Scale 75's Scale Color 45. Then we hit the whole model with some dark tone wash from Army Painter. This is to tint that green down to a darker tone and to quickly line the recesses of those scales. Then we take that same Ardennes green, only this time we're going to apply it as a dry brush as the first step in our highlighting process for the scales. This step is pretty forgiving and you can be sloppy with it. We're just trying to distinguish the recesses from the raised areas of the scales and establish some depth. Our next highlight is going to be some Irati green, or Scale Color 43. Now, I know that this green looks very bright, but actually when we apply it with that dry brush over the previous screen, you can see here that it actually picks out those details nicely and looks better than you would expect. We make sure to maintain a top-down sweeping motion so that we can only get the topmost edges, as this is the brightest highlight for our scales. Next, we come in with some Army Painter matte black and we lay down the base coat for the carapace. This base coat took longer than expected because every time I looked at it, there was a little piece of green poking out from the deepest recesses here. It was actually pretty frustrating. And we're going to load up some Black Forest Green Scale Color 41 onto our dry brush. The reason I am using a green this dark is because I want that back scales carapace area to still read to the eye as black. Using this method can give the black areas on our models a little bit more character. Then with that Army Painter matte black, we start to paint in all the claws on this gator. We start with the hands, then we go down to the feet and we start to cut those in with that same black. And then I start to cut in all these little spike areas here on his thigh and on his shoulder. And we're using the same matte black that we used on the claws. I decided to highlight these with that same black forest green that we used on the carapace area. I was debating between doing this gray and green, but I felt that this black forest green just looked better on the model. After I finish up with that, I take some cold gray from Vallejo and I start to do a little bit of an edge highlight on all of the claws. This gray highlight should help differentiate the claws from the back scale area. And to get rid of that dusty look on these back scales, I take some Army Painter dark tone wash and apply that to the whole back. I also apply that dark tone wash to the claws and the thigh and shoulder spikes. If you can't tell, I'm a big fan of using washes selectively for definition. I guess what I'm really doing here is blacklining all of these scales. Next up starts the arduous task of painting these belly scales. The reason it's arduous is because we're painting yellow, and yellow is one of those colors for me that just takes a long time to make look good. Now, the base coat we're using here is Sherwood Green, scale color 44. Needless to say, over the dark green that I'm painting, this took about 10,000 coats. And then I screwed it up by applying the dark tone wash to the entire thing instead of applying it selectively like I've been doing for this entire paint job. It doesn't look that bad right here, but once it dried, oh man, did I get some pooling and some tide marks. To remedy this, I had to come back in with that Sherwood Green and redefine my midtone. I carefully apply this, making sure to avoid all of the recesses. Luckily, that wash step wasn't a total loss. I apply 2 coats of this Sherwood Green, the second shallower than the first, so that we can start defining this transition to our brightest highlight. With belly scales on reptiles, the way they overlap and the way that I paint them, the brightest highlight is actually towards the bottom of the scale. Here I'm applying Fall Green scale color 48 as our highlight. Now, this is where the scale color's opacity really comes in. We are able to benefit from that low opacity when we are layering. Each layer we lay down is thinner than the last, and with that, the opacity becomes greater, and thus, our highlight becomes brighter. Layering is not a very complicated technique, however, it is a time-consuming one, especially when you're dealing with a color such as yellow. Yellow is a notoriously difficult color to paint, and for me personally, it is the bane of my existence. This is the color that gives me the most trouble, and that is why I'm featuring it so prominently on this army, to give me practice. After we're done with the yellow, I start to lay down the base tones for the ropes that are wrapped around this Wrastler, and I'm doing this with some heavy brown from Vallejo Game Color. This took a couple coats, mostly because of the darker undercoat and also because of all of the ridges here. I ran into the same issue that I ran into with the back scales. I kept finding areas that I missed. Then I apply some strong tone wash from Army Painter to all these ropes to help give some definition in those recesses. After giving the wash the appropriate time to dry, I come in with a selective dry brush with some Iraqi sand from Vallejo Model Color. As you can see here, I'm using a smaller dry brush, and that's because I'm trying not to get any spillover onto the parts of the model that we've already finished. I did, however, have to come in later and clean up some of these knuckles and back scales that got a little bit of tan on them. Now, I wanted to make this pauldron stand out, so I decided I wanted to use some Turbo Dork paint on there. And according to the bottle, it needs to be applied over a black base coat. While I was waiting for that pauldron to dry, I decided to base coat the interior of this gator's mouth. And I did this with some pure red from Army Painter. And then I come back to the pauldron and I apply a second coat of that Army Painter matte black. Once that black base coat has been established, it's time to have some fun, and the Turbo Dork paint I'm using here is Shell Shocked. It's supposed to transition from a purple to a teal depending on how the light is hitting it. Once I started applying this second coat here, I started to be able to see exactly how this paint was going to respond, and I gotta say, the camera does it no justice. It looks so much better to the eye. Once that has dried, I come in with some gunmetal and I start to paint all of the raised edges to this pauldron. I only want the flat section of this pauldron to have the Turbo Dork paint on it. I'm trying to avoid it looking too gaudy. We also take the gunmetal and we apply that to all of the spikes and rivets on the pauldron. Once the gunmetal has dried, I come in with some plate silver and I establish some highlights on this true metallic metal. It's going to go on the topmost edges of the pauldron and the tips of the spikes and the rivets. Then we break out the trusty old dark tone wash again, and we wash only the edges of the pauldron. I don't want to wash the Turbo Dork paint because it's just going to defeat the entire purpose of it. Again, essentially what I'm doing with this dark tone is I'm using it as a liner. I want it to pull into the recess between the silver and the Turbo Dork paint. Now, I am lacking in options for purple, and I didn't have a purple as dark as I wanted it for the base coat for the mask. So what I'm doing here is I'm mixing in a little bit of black to my alien purple from Army Painter. As you can see here as I'm applying this, that it's a really nice, dark, muted purple. It's the perfect starting tone for a purple leather. And with this mask, we're going to use the simple adage of 2 thin coats. Getting complete coverage over that green is seeming to be a task even for the darker colors that I'm using on this model. From there we come in with some pure alien purple from Army Painter and we start to establish our mid-tones. The way I tend to paint is I like to start from my darkest shadow and build up from there. I'm trying to leave only those deepest recesses as that darker purple that we applied as our base coat, which are our darkest shadows. And then from there I come in with some ooze purple from Army Painter and I begin to stipple in our brightest highlights. The reason I am using the stippling technique is because I want to imitate that leather texture, and stippling is the technique that is perfect for achieving this exact goal. Once all of the purple has been established, I start to paint in this thread, and I am using Iraqi sand from Vallejo Model Color for this. Now we have to take our time with this because we don't want to ruin all the work and time we spent on establishing those purples. This is one of those times when your brush control is fairly important. However, don't worry, if you do get some spillover, it can be fixed. Then we take some off-white and we apply a dotted highlight to each of these threads. We want this to actually look like thread. We don't really want it to look like the ropes. And the final step on the threads here is to take some strong tone wash from Army Painter and apply that to the threads. This will give that deeper shadow and line the thread away from the actual mask itself. And then we take the dark tone wash and we line the recesses between the snout and the mask. This is to make it look like the mask is actually draped over the model and not a part of the model itself. Then we take some Vallejo Game Color Squid Pink and we apply some little highlights to the tongue. And then we apply a red tone wash to all those fleshy mouth bits. From there we cut in all of the teeth, and we do this with Vallejo Off-White. I'm just taking my time and making sure not to get that white on the green snout. Now, an alligator's teeth aren't perfectly white, so we're going to apply a soft tone wash from Army Painter to all of the teeth to give them a little bit of a grimy look. And then we come in with that off-white again, and we only paint the tips of the teeth, leaving that soft tone only at the base of the tooth itself. And then the last thing we have to paint is the eyes. I want to use that fluorescent magenta, so the first thing I have to do is base coat the eyes with pure white. And then once I come in with that fluorescent magenta from Vallejo, as you can see here, it just pops right out. No need for even a second coat. And as you can see here, we were actually painting 2 gators at the same time, and this is them completed. The basis for these gators is going to be the traditional swamp theme, and I did that off camera. From the different angles of these pictures, you can kind of see how that shell-shocked turbo dork paint transitions on these pauldrons. And I think I did a pretty good job in avoiding the gaudiness with those. It was close. So, what'd you think about the Wrastler? I, for one, am very happy with how that paint job turned out. I spent a little bit more time than I wanted to on those belly scales, but the end result I can't complain with. It turned out amazing. And the cloth on his head, or the purple leather, with that stippling technique that I used, I feel like that's a really nice focal point on this model. Along with that pauldron, when we use that turbo dork paint. Now, I didn't include in this video how I do my swamp bases, primarily because of time. I like to try and keep these videos as short as I can and cut out as much of the fat as possible. However, if you would like to see how I make my swamp bases, leave a comment in the comments section down below. And if enough people are interested, I'll show you how I do it. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, all that other social media stuff. It really does help out the channel a lot, and I personally appreciate it very much. For now, I've got to fly. As always, keep on painting, peeps.